Hey there nation, welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another edition of Cheap Shots. This is a series of videos designed to help you guys save money on the Wargaming hobby, and on this episode number 47, we're going to show you guys how to quickly as well as cheaply paint up some Poxwalkers for your Death Guard armies, or in this case, as you can see here, I'm using them for my Carnival of Chaos army in an upcoming Mordheim campaign. So as you can see here in the end result, it's going to cost you a grand total of $42.05 in order to paint up this quick paint method that we have, as opposed to buying materials from Army Painter and Games Workshop. That'll save you a grand total of $170.14 in savings. And as you can see in this picture, this is what the end result will look like for your miniatures if you decide to paint using the Cheapskate method that we're going to show you here today. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this video on a roll. I'm going to talk about exactly how you can paint up some Poxwalkers both quickly and cheaply and save $170+ on it. Alright, first thing ladies and gentlemen you need to do is base spray your miniatures. In this case, I recommend using Rust-Oleum Camouflage Spray Paint Olive Green. It's a nice matte finish on that spray painting green. It's got a nice kind of sickly olive drab green color that you spray all over the miniatures. And the reason why is because a lot of flesh on these Poxwalkers are exposed, and that's a really good base color to use on them as well. And that's exactly what I decided to do here. As you can see, I just gave the once over real quick with some Rust-Oleum Camouflage Olive Green paint and did a really good job laying down a really good solid base coat for the entirety of the miniature. And this is one of the things that's really going to help us out to paint up these miniatures very quickly. And can of that stuff will run you $3.99 at your local Walmart. Alright, so once you guys get done with the base spray, the next thing you do, of course, is do a quick dry brush over all of your miniatures. In this case, I use Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. It's a nice sickly green color. It does a really nice job of catching the highlights in the miniatures. Managed to capture all the textures as well as the highlights, make them a nice sickly kind of green color while leaving that camouflage olive drab color in the recesses of the miniature as well. So it's really nice and kind of makes that have some nice three-dimensionality to it, catching the highlights and leaving the recess colors dark real quick. And my suggestion to you is when you do this dry brush is of course work in layers. You could always start off with a light base coat and work up to whatever degree of brightness that you want. Always work in layers because it's always easy to put on dry brush. It's very, very difficult to take it off once it's on. And so as you can see in this picture here, I just did a really quick heavy dry brush with my Lime Sherbet, and I'm ready to move on to my next step. Alright, the next step is to do a base coat with 2 thin coats of Bright Magenta by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And these are things like for the organs and the rips in the skin that is exposed to the characters. They also have a lot of tentacles growing on them as well, and that's exactly what I decided to use that for. Did 2 thin coats of Bright Magenta. Now the nice part about painting these miniatures is that because they're Nurgle miniatures, you don't necessarily need to be very neat when you paint these miniatures. So if you're starting off painting brand new, my suggestion is to use Nurgle miniatures, because if you make a mistake, it's not that big a deal. The reason why is because for these tentacles and organs that we have in these pictures, we're going to add some homemade blood effect to them as well. So if you manage to make mistakes and paint over, that's perfectly fine because the blood can then just go on top of it and hide any mistakes that you make as well. Like I said before, this stuff is available at Walmart for 50 cents. I just do 2 thin coats on the tentacles and the parts that I want to paint in bright pink, and then from there ready to move on. Alright, so the next color is to do 2 base coats of Khaki by Apple Barrel Paint. You can find that at your local Walmart for 50 cents, and these are for all the spines and spikes and talons and teeth and claws that these miniatures have. There's quite a bit of bone growth coming off these miniatures, so you just need to find the parts that you want to paint up in that bone color. 2 thin coats of Khaki by Apple Barrel Paint does a beautiful job of bringing that out. And once again, like I said before, if you make any mistakes, do not worry, because this method of painting for Nurgle miniatures is very forgiving, because you could always put homemade blood and rot effect on these guys and cover up any mistakes that you make. So just do 2 thin coats real quick of Khaki and you're ready to move on for your next detail. Alright, now it's time to move on to the detail portions of the flesh. In this case, I decided to pick out the eyes as well as any pustules around the bodies of the miniatures as well. I decided to use Sky Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice pastel light blue color. It contrasts very nicely with the green undercoats that you're putting on the miniatures. So for example, for all the eyes on my Nurglings as well as my Poxwalkers, I just put a little dot of Sky Blue on them. You can get that at your local Walmart, runs you 50 cents. It's really, really simple on that. And then for the pustules around these bodies, I use Americana's Coral Shell. I got that from my local Hobby Lobby for that. And for the Americana Coral Shell, that runs about 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. Just did a real quick little dot of that stuff on all the pustules. It makes a nice little rotty color that kind of makes it look like it's infected and pus-ridden. So it looks really, really nice, especially when you get done with the actual finish on this. So once again, just put like little dots of that stuff over all the pustules as you want to. And once you're done with those fine details on the flesh, the next thing we need to work now are on the boils that are covering these miniatures as well. Alright, so for this phase, for another one, we do a base coat using Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint, and in this picture I take out all the boils that are covering the miniatures as well. There's quite a lot of these infectious looking disease flesh on these Poxwalkers, so it's really simple. I just put a thin coat of Kiwi on it. Kiwi is a nice bright green that's almost a yellowish color. It contrasts very nicely with the olive drab undercoat as well as the Kiwi that we put on these, as well as the lime sherbet that we used on these miniatures earlier. And as you can see in this picture, you can see where the bright green is kind of showing up using this two thin coats of Apple Barrel Kiwi. And like I said before, you don't need to be particularly neat when you actually do this process. That's the nice thing about miniatures made by Nurgle miniatures. They're very forgiving, because if you mess up, that's okay, because you can just cover your mistakes with rot as well as blood effects, and it'll end up working for the best. So all you gotta do is just put two thin coats of Kiwi with this color. You can get this at your local Walmart, runs you 50 cents, and you get a 2-ounce tube of it at the same time. I'm a big fan of this color. Alright, so now that we're done with all of the flesh, time to move on to the clothing of these miniatures as well. So for my miniatures, I decided to go with these really bright and vibrant colors for my Poxwalkers. The reason why is because I'm planning on using these Poxwalkers as a Carnival of Chaos warband for an upcoming Mordheim campaign that I'm using. So because they're supposed to be carnival folk, I wanted their colors to be bright and bold because, you know, to represent that they're circus workers. So in this case, what I decided to use was several colors. I decided to use Apple Barrel's Ripe Tomato, Apple Barrel's Wild Iris, Anita's Acrylic Pure Red, True Red rather, I'm sorry, Bright Blue by Apple Barrel, as well as King Gold by Apple Barrel as well. And as you can see in this photo, I just put two thin layers of this stuff on all the clothing that I wanted done for these characters. Most of the Apple Barrel paints will run you 50 cents at your local Walmart, while the Anita's Acrylic you can get at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. Put on two thin coats of that stuff and let it dry, and then afterwards, if you have any leather goods that you want to have painted like a brown color, I decided to add some brown leather goods for some of my miniatures. I just used Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. It's another wonderful product offered at Walmart, runs you 50 cents for that as well, and put two thin layers on that. So these are things like belts, holsters, sheaths that are on the miniatures as well. So just put your two thin coats on that stuff, and then you're ready to move on. Alright, so once you're done with that, the next thing to work on is to work on the leather goods on these miniatures as well. These are things like belts, boots, and in this case I put hats on my miniatures. As you can see there, I put some hats on them real quick as a quick little conversion work that I did on these guys to make them look like circus workers. At the same time, you also want to pick out their hair as well. The hats that I put on these miniatures had hair in the back of them, so that's the reason why I painted them up. So for all the leather goods that I wanted to be black, I used just real quick little tube there. As you can see, that's accent acrylic paint. That company is no longer around anymore. It's just straight up black acrylic paint. You could easily use Apple Barrel paint, runs you 50 cents. I bought this stuff back in the mid 90s when I was a kid, but it works the same as Apple Barrel paint as well. So you just put two thin coats of pure black paint on all the parts that you want to have black leather. And the same thing with the hair. In this case, I decided to use a gray color to make it look like their hair is kind of weathered and worn. So I just put two thin layers of Anita's acrylic gray that you can get at your local Hobby Lobby, runs you 65 cents. And I just put two thin layers on everything that I want to be black as well as gray. And as you can see, it has a really nice finish when it's all done. So now that we're done base coating those colors, next thing we need to do real quick is to dry brush them. So for the dry brush on this one, I use Folk Arts Pale Gray. It runs you 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. It's a very pale gray that almost borders on white, and what I did is I just did a really light dry brushing with this stuff on the hats as well as the hair, as well as the black leather goods on the miniatures as well. This helps to once again pick up the highlights on the black as well as the gray and leaves a darker color down the recesses, add some nice three-dimensionality to your miniatures, and make them look really nice and really pop at the same time. And I suggest that you go very lightly with this pale gray. It's a very strong gray color, almost white. If you do too much of a dry brush, it could overpower your dark color that you put underneath, so just do it very lightly. You can always add more to bring it to the brightness that you desire, so just work in layers in that situation. Alright, now it's time for us to start working on the detailed aspects of these miniatures. In this case, I use burnt umber for the grips on some of these weapons. So for example, my Carnival Master, he's carrying around this huge mallet, while the guy on the right hand side, another one of my brother, he's carrying like a hammer as well. And so because I decided to paint those grips in a wooden color, so I just put two thin coats of burnt umber by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. Just put two thin coats on that color, and it has a really nice finish afterwards as well. And once again, I just did a real quick dry brush on those wooden accents with Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs 50 cents at your local Walmart. Just did a quick once over real fast to bring out the three-dimensionality as well as the wood grain within the grips that they're carrying as well, to add some more detail for it. It brings up the highlights with that Territorial Beige and leaves that dark umber brown color in the recess of the miniature. It looks really nice when you combine these two products. So now that we're done with the wooden grips, now it's time to move on to the metallics. Alright, so now it's time to move on to the metallics in this situation. I use 3 colors. For all the parts that are going to be in silver, I use Gunmetal Gray. It's made by Folk Art. You can get that at your local Hobby Lobby for 75 cents. For all the golden accents, like on their belt buckles and other small details, like the buttons on the red coat of the Carnival Master, I picked those out in pure gold by Folk Art. Those run you about 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby there as well. And then, of course, I also picked out some copper details on the miniatures, like the Brethren there carrying a wrench. I use copper by Folk Art, runs you 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby as well. So once you find all your metallics, you just go and just do 2 thin coats of your metallics on all the parts that you want to be painted silver, gold, and copper. And then from there, we're ready to move on to the final accent piece. So my final accent piece, I used Tahitian Blue by Delta Sarin Coat. I got this at my local Hobby Lobby, runs you about 65 cents for that stuff. And the reason why I did that is I put it on the cording of the grips as well as some of the wrappings on their weapons, just because it's a nice bright contrasting color that just kind of catches the eye real quick. So I just did 2 thin layers of that stuff. It's really, really quick and easy to use, and adds some really nice interest to your miniature by adding a nice little burst of color. So now that we're all done with the base coating and the dry branding of these miniatures, the next thing we need to do now is an oil wash. So because this is a quick paint method, we use an oil wash and do an all-over oil wash on these miniatures. You could use Army Painter Strong Tone, but the problem with that product is that it's super expensive. It runs about $32. Whereas you got some mid-wax poly shades, Mission Oak Color does exactly the same thing, only costs $7. So all I did in this situation is cut it with a little bit of paint thinner to make it a little bit more thinned out. And as you can see, I just do an all-over wash with the oil wash. The oil wash does a really good job. First off, it flattens your dry brushing. Your dry brushing will have like this chalky kind of pastel texture left on your miniatures. By using that poly shade, it flattens those textures down. It also blends the colors quite nicely, so that way your dry brushing as well as your undercoat kind of merge together and looks really, really nice and kind of brings those colors together. At the same time, the poly shade also creeps into the recesses of your miniature as well, bringing a lot of the details inside the crevices of your miniature as well. Now, this stuff is also polyurethane, so because that does have a clear coat on it, and my recommendation to you is once you put the poly shade on the miniature, wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry as well as cure. You could, of course, continue working on your miniatures earlier if you want to, but if it's still sticky, you might not want to mess with the miniature, just because you might accidentally rip off layers of paint and destroy the finish on your miniatures, and I'm speaking from experience on this part. So it's best just to do it within a 24-hour period. For me, I usually paint in the evening, so when I do the oil wash, it's the last step I do for my miniatures, and then I return back to the next evening to carry on with my painting afterwards. So give this stuff about 24 hours to dry, and then you're ready to move on. So the next step, of course, is to a spray varnish. In this case, I use a matte varnish. This is, of course, optional. The reason why is because the polyurethane inside of the mid-wax poly shade will give your miniatures a high gloss sheen on your miniatures. Now, if you're a fan of that candy coating look, you could, of course, just skip this part and ignore it. I'm not a big fan of the shine, so because I like to put a matte varnish on these miniatures, I use Krylon's matte varnish spray. Runs you $5.99 at your local Walmart. Just do a quick once over, and as you can see here, it takes away that sheen at the same time, brings out all those details on the miniatures as well. As you can see, our bright colors have been muted down significantly. At the same time, you can see a lot of the details that we have. It's also blended our layers of dry brushing and also gives us a nice, really dark look to the miniatures as well. It looks absolutely fantastic. So now that we're done doing that, the next step, of course, is to add some homemade blood as well as rot effect. Alright, so my homemade blood effect. I found a really quick, easy method of doing this. I like using mid-wax polyacrylic, water-based polyacrylic. It's a protective finish on the miniature. And I use a clear gloss is what I use to give that nice, shiny look to make it look like it's fresh blood. All I do is I just add some polyacrylic into a mix pot, add some drops of some Anita's True Red until I get the consistency color that I want, and then from there I just paint this all over the parts that were painted in pink earlier. Things like the tentacles as well as the intestines of the Carnival Master. I just add a thin coat of this stuff and just slop it on as well. If you have any missteps where you put some pink on the flesh parts, that's perfectly fine. This is what I was talking about earlier. You just use that blood effect to cover up any mistakes that you made, and it just makes it look even more rotty, gory, and nasty looking. It just only adds to the effect of your miniatures as well. When this stuff dries, it will have a high gloss finish on it and make it look like it's really gory and bloody. Now, you could, of course, use blood from the Blood God from Citadel Paint if you want to. It's a fine product, it's really good. But for me, though, it's a little expensive for what I want, and I just, with this combination, I can make as much blood effect as I want for pennies. The polyacrylic costs you $5.99 at your local Walmart, and then Anita's acrylic runs you 75 cents, and at your local Hobby Lobby, and you'll never run out of blood effect. And now that we're done with the blood effect, the next thing we do now is add our rot effect. So as you can see in these miniatures, they have it covered in pustules and boils and stuff. So make it look like it's oozing pus, I just once again put my homemade rot mix in there. I just use polyacrylics clear gloss from Winmax polyacrylic, there we go, and I add some lime green, some bright green ink from Amsterdam, New Amsterdam ink. Just put a couple of drops in that mixture, mix it to the consistency that I want, and I just slap it onto the miniature as well. You could of course use nickel rods if you want to, but with this method you'll never run out of nickel rod effect if you ever have to make it again. So that's why I like using this method. It's cheaper, it's easier, and I just slow it onto my miniatures. And as you can see there, I just put it all over the parts that were green and the pustules, and it just kind of blends it together. It also hides many great mistakes that you might have made in your painting process, and it makes it look really, really nice as well. Like I said, if you have any mistakes on the miniatures, just add this rod effect to it, and I'll completely hide it and just make it look like it's more nasty looking, which is always a good thing for Nurgle miniatures. So now that we're done with the blood and gore effect on the miniatures, now it's time to move on to the bases. So on the bases on this one, the first thing I do, of course, is add my texturing, which is a mixture of sand and wood glue and water. That's what I just put onto the bases to add some texturing as well. Now, my texturing and my base work on these miniatures are going to be a little bit different. Usually when I work on Nurgle miniatures, I put on a burnt sienna with my homemade rod effect to make it look like they're walking across a toxic wasteland is what I usually use. But because I plan on using my corpse cart from our studio's Undead Army to be the plague cart that we use for the Carnival of Chaos, I decided to make these guys match their bases to the Undead miniature base. So it's the basing work on this one's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to use the same base work I used for the Vampire Count's army in our studio in order to make them match. That way it looks, you know, seamless together when they're playing on the battlefield. So in this case, what I did is I put 2 thin layers of pavement, which is made by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a really dark gray color. I just put 2 thin layers over the entirety of the base, so that way I have a good base work to work off of. Pavement's actually not black, it's a super dark gray, and it does a wonderful job, especially when you highlight it with some other colors of gray. Alright, so as you can see in this method here, what I decided to do is use some dry brushing real quick with some Anita's acrylic real fast. Just did a real quick dry brush to kind of bring out the texture there. You can get this crew gray color from Anita's acrylic at your local Hobby Lobby for 75 cents. And then I do another dry brush with Pale Gray by Folk Art one more time just to make it look like I have like this stony kind of gravelly look to it. I just did a real liberal dry brushing with this Pale Gray all over the bases. And as you can see there, it brings out all that texture, make it look like they're walking across granite and other, you know, highland looking type of gravel that they're walking across. It looks really, really nice as well. So once we're done with the dry brush, the next thing you do now is add some flock. So the last thing you do real quick is add some flock. In this case, I just put some wood glue on the bases that I wanted the flocking to be on there, and I used our homemade flock. The flocking that we use in our studio is made by Iron Major. Iron Major just takes sawdust is what he does. He takes sawdust, he takes different colored greens, he mixes them together, lets it dry and cure to make his homemade flock for all of his terrain. So he gave me a bag of that stuff, and as you can see, all I did was just dust it real quick with some homemade flock that we made, and it looks absolutely fantastic and ready to go. So once that glue is dried with the flock on it, the last thing you need to do real quick is to rim the bases. And like I said before, because I want these guys to match up my Vampire Count's army, because I'm planning on using the corpse cart from that to be the plague cart, I just put 2 thin coats of English Ivy Green by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart, and it gives a nice, beautiful, dark, earthy, kind of grassy look to these miniatures as well. It contrasts really nicely with the gray base as well as the homemade flock that we used on it. And then once you're done with that, your miniatures are fully completed. And once again, here is the end result what the miniatures look like. Now with that being said, let's go and talk about exactly the difference between both the Cheapskate method as well as the Citadel method. So if you're going to get the shopping list from both Citadel as well as Army Painter, these are the materials that you'll need to do. For the base coat, you'll need to buy a can of Death Guard green spray that runs at $19.50, and then you'll need to dry brush that green with Cyberite green, which runs you $4.55. From there, all the pink parts that we painted up in pink, you'll need to buy a Screamer pink, which runs you $4.55 for that, and for all the bone parts of the miniatures, we use Morghast bone, which also runs you $4.55. Now for the eyes, you need to pick out those details with Blue Horror, which runs you $4.55, and then for all the pustules that we had over the bodies, we'll pick out those details on Lugganath Orange, which also runs you $4.55. Now from there, for all the boils that are covering the body, we pick those out in Moot Green, which runs you $4.55, and then for the weapon grips that we have, as well as some of the cloth that we use Baylor Brown, which runs you $4.55 for that. Now for the clothing, you'll need to use Troll Slayer Orange for the orange cloth, Nagaroth Night for all the purple, Teclis Blue for all the blue, Averlin Sunset for all the yellow, and Mephiston Red for all the red portions. And each of those pots will run you $4.55 for those. Now for the hats as well as the hair, you'll need to use Slanesh Gray for the hair, which runs you $4.55, and Abaddon Black for the hats, as well as the black leather goods, which runs you $4.55 for those. Now you'll need to dry brush those again with Luthalwan Gray, which runs you $4.55 for that. Now for the weapon grips, you'll need to use Wildwood, which is a contrast paint, which runs you $7.80 for that as well. Now for the metallics, you'll need to use lead belcher for all the parts that we did in silver, retributor armor for all the parts that we did in gold, as well as screaming bell for all the parts that we did in copper. And all three of those run you $7.80 at your local game shop or ordering online from Games Workshop. Now once you're done with that, of course, you'll need to buy a pot of Baharoth blue for all the little weapon grips that we have, as well as the cording on the weapons, and then runs you $4.55. Now if you were to do the quick paint method, you'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, runs you $32 for do that oil wash. And if you decide to put a matte finish on your miniatures, you'll need to buy a can of Munitorium Varnish, which runs you $19.50 for that. Now last thing we're going to do, of course, is talk about exactly what you should do for the bases. You'll need to use once again Eshin Grey, which runs you $4.55 for that, and you also need to use Blood for the Blood God, as well as Nurgle's Rot for the blood, as well as the rot effects, and both those run you $4.55 per pot. Then of course, to do the texturing on the bases with the flocking, you'll need to buy Army Painter's basing set, which runs you $18.99, and then to rim the bases, you'll need to use Vulcan Green, which runs you $4.55 for that. Now assuming you're buying everything for the very first time on the Citadel paint method, it'll cost you a grand total of $212.19 in order to paint up these miniatures using the method that we use, but using the Citadel as well as Army Painter method. Now if you compare to what we showed you guys for the Cheapskate method, assuming you have to buy all those paints and materials for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total of $42.05. When you subtract $42.05 from the grand total of $212.19 from the Citadel method, we're talking about a grand total savings of $170.14, which could buy you a hell of a lot of miniatures, or even a box set of miniatures as well from one of the starting box sets too. Or better yet, don't even spend it all and just save that money for something better. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's how you guys can quickly as well as cheaply paint up some Poxwalkers. As always, you guys, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to our channel. That's going to do it for this one, you guys. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out and stay classy.